Atlantis is usually treated as a question. Did it exist or didn't it? But within the systems described in the secret teachings of all ages, that question is not the point, because Atlantis is not presented as something to be proven. It is presented as something to be understood, not as a location, but as a structure, a model of civilization where knowledge, symbol, and power were not separated into different systems, but operated as one. And this is what makes it significant, because if you look at the progression we've already moved through, the mysteries, initiation, the schools, the initiates, the temple, symbolic language, each of those elements has been explored as a separate component. Atlantis represents the point where those components are unified, not fragmented, not distributed, but functioning together as a single system. And this is why it continues to appear across different traditions, under different names, in different forms, because it is not describing a place alone, it is describing a state, a level of coherence where structure is not hidden, it is embedded into everything. Which means the real question is not whether Atlantis existed in the way it is described, but what kind of system it represents, and more importantly, what happens when that system is no longer intact. If the earlier stages of this series explored how knowledge is structured, then Atlantis represents what that structure looks like when it is fully integrated. Because within the systems described in the secret teachings of all ages, Atlantis is not positioned as a beginning in the sense of something primitive. It is positioned as a peak, a point where symbolic language, initiation, environment and knowledge are no longer separate systems that need to be learned individually, but aspects of a unified whole. This is a crucial shift, because everything we have explored so far has required progression, step by step, layer by layer. But Atlantis is described as a state where that progression has already taken place, where the structure has stabilized, where the system is no longer being assembled, but is already functioning. And when a system reaches that point, something changes. It becomes self-reinforcing. Knowledge is no longer something that needs to be preserved externally, because it is embedded into the way the civilization itself operates, into its architecture, its symbols, its systems of communication, its structures of power. Everything reflects the same underlying pattern. This is what gives Atlantis its weight within the mystery traditions. Not as a lost city, but as a reference point, a model of coherence. But before we move deeper into how that coherence is described and what specific elements define it, take a moment to ground yourself in the progression of this series. If you're starting to see how each part connects, how the structure builds from one episode to the next, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because this is not a collection of isolated ideas. It is a system unfolding, and the further you move into it, the more that system begins to reveal itself. So the question becomes, if Atlantis represents a fully integrated system, what exactly holds that system together? To understand what holds a system like Atlantis together, you have to look beyond the idea of civilization as something built from physical structures alone. Because within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, the foundation of Atlantis is not material, it is structural. Not in the sense of buildings, but in the sense of relationships. The relationship between knowledge and environment, between symbol and meaning, between perception and reality. In earlier stages, these relationships had to be taught. They had to be introduced through initiation, reinforced through structure, and maintained through discipline. But within Atlantis, those same relationships are described as inherent. They do not need to be explained because they are already embedded into the system. This is what creates coherence, not the presence of advanced knowledge, but the alignment, of that knowledge with every other aspect of the civilization. Nothing exists in isolation. Every element reflects the same underlying structure, and when that alignment is in place, something changes in how knowledge functions. It is no longer something that needs to be protected. It becomes self-sustaining, because it is not stored in one place. It is distributed across everything. This is why the descriptions of Atlantis often emphasize harmony, not as an aesthetic quality, but as a structural condition, a state where the relationships between elements are stable enough to maintain themselves without constant correction. But this stability does not come from simplicity. It comes from precision, because for a system to remain coherent at that level, every component has to align. Every symbol, every structure, every method of transmission. And this is where Atlantis differs from the systems that follow it, because once that level of precision begins to weaken, the system can no longer maintain itself. The relationships begin to loosen, the alignment begins to shift, and when that happens, the coherence that once held everything together starts to fragment. But before that fragmentation begins, there is a moment where the system is still intact, still functioning, still capable of sustaining itself without external correction. And that moment is what Atlantis represents, not the beginning of civilization, but the point where civilization reaches structural unity, where knowledge is not separate from life, it is embedded within it. And once you see it this way, the idea of Atlantis shifts. It is no longer something distant. It becomes a reference point for what a fully integrated system looks like, and that raises the next question. If coherence is what defines Atlantis, what causes it to break? If Atlantis represents a state of coherence, then the next layer of understanding lies in how that coherence is maintained. Because alignment, once achieved, does not sustain itself automatically. It requires balance. Not balance in the sense of stability alone, but balance between forces that are constantly interacting. Within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, these forces are often expressed symbolically. Light and darkness, order and chaos, expansion and contraction. These are not opposites in conflict, they are complementary. Each one defines the other, and within a coherent system, they exist in relationship rather than opposition. This is what allows the system to remain dynamic without becoming unstable, because a system that is entirely fixed cannot adapt, and a system that is entirely fluid cannot hold structure. Coherence exists between these two conditions. It allows for movement, but within a framework that prevents collapse. In Atlantis, this balance is described as being maintained across all levels, not just within individuals, but within the civilization as a whole. The structures of knowledge reflect the same balance as the structures of power. The symbolic systems reflect the same balance as the physical environment. Everything operates according to the same underlying pattern. This is what creates continuity, because when every part of a system reflects the same relationships, those relationships reinforce each other. They stabilize the system without requiring constant intervention. But this also reveals something important, because if coherence depends on balance, then imbalance becomes the point of failure, not immediately, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual shift, a deviation in the relationships that hold the system together. At first, this shift may be subtle, almost unnoticeable. The system continues to function, the structures remain in place, but the alignment begins to weaken, and once that weakening begins, the system has to compensate. It has to correct itself. But if the deviation continues, those corrections become less effective. The balance becomes harder to maintain. And over time, the coherence that once defined the system begins to break down. This is not described as an external event. It is internal, a change in the relationships that sustain the system. And this is what leads into the idea of collapse, not as a sudden destruction, but as the result of a process, a gradual movement away from alignment, which means the fall of Atlantis is not separate from its structure, it is the consequence of it. And that is what makes it significant, because it shows that even a fully integrated system contains the conditions for its own breakdown, and once that process begins, it cannot be reversed in the same form. When you step back from the description of Atlantis as a civilization, what becomes clear is that its function is not historical in the way it is often treated. It is structural, because what is being described is not simply a place that existed and was lost. It is a model, a way of illustrating what happens when every layer of a system aligns. Knowledge, environment, symbol, power, perception, all operating according to the same underlying pattern. And when that alignment is in place, the system appears complete, self-sustaining, coherent. But this is also what makes it fragile, not in an obvious way, but in a structural one, because when every part of a system depends on that alignment, even a small deviation can begin to affect everything else. The system does not break immediately. It adjusts, it compensates, it attempts to maintain its balance. But if the deviation continues, those adjustments begin to accumulate, and over time the coherence that once held the system together starts to dissolve. This is where Atlantis shifts from being a description of unity to a reference point for fragmentation. Not because it disappears entirely, but because its structure can no longer be maintained in the same form. And once that happens, the system has to change. It has to redistribute, it has to find new ways of preserving what can no longer be held in a single unified structure. This is where symbols, myths, and separate traditions begin to emerge, not as inventions but as fragments, pieces of a system that was once whole, now existing independently. And this is why Atlantis continues to appear across different cultures, because what is being remembered is not the place itself, but the structure it represents, a memory of coherence, a reference to something that once operated as a unified system. And once you see it this way, Atlantis becomes less about the past and more about the pattern, a pattern that can be recognized whenever systems move toward alignment and whenever they begin to move away from it, which means the real significance of Atlantis is not in its existence. It is in what it reveals about how systems function, how they stabilize, how they fragment, and how the transition between those two states begins. And that transition is where the next stage begins, because once coherence is lost, what remains has to be preserved in a different way. If Atlantis represents a system in perfect alignment, then its significance does not end with its existence. It extends into what follows, because a system that is fully integrated does not simply disappear without consequence. It leaves traces, not always in a complete form, but in fragments, in symbols, in patterns that persist even when the original structure can no longer be maintained. This is where the idea of Atlantis begins to shift. It is no longer just a model of coherence. It becomes the point of transition, the moment where unity begins to give way to distribution, where a system that once operated as a whole starts to break into parts that must now function independently. And this is where preservation changes, because when coherence is lost, knowledge can no longer be held within a single structure. It has to be embedded, distributed across different systems, encoded into symbols, carried through myth, maintained in fragments that can survive even when the original form cannot. This is why the legacy of Atlantis does not appear as a continuation of the same system. It appears as variation, different traditions, different symbols, different interpretations of what was once aligned, each one holding a part of the structure, but not the whole. And this is where the next stage begins, because once knowledge is fragmented, it requires a different method of preservation. It can no longer rely on direct transmission. It must be encoded, embedded into systems that can carry it across time without needing to remain intact. This is where the fall of Atlantis becomes significant, not as an ending, but as a transformation, a shift from unity to multiplicity, from coherence to distribution, from direct structure to symbolic preservation. And this shift is what allows the system to continue, not in its original form, but in a way that can survive, because what cannot remain whole can still be remembered, not as a complete structure, but as a pattern that continues to appear, even in fragments. And once those fragments begin to be recognized, they can be traced, connected, reassembled, not to recreate what was lost, but to understand how it functioned. Because the fall of Atlantis is not separate from its structure, it is the next stage of it. And that is where we move next. Atlantis represents coherence, then its fall represents something far more complex than destruction. Because within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, collapse is not an event, it is a process, not something that happens suddenly, but something that unfolds gradually as the relationships that hold the system together begin to shift. At first, nothing appears to change. The structures remain, the symbols still exist, the systems continue to function, but beneath that surface alignment begins to weaken. The precision that once held everything in balance starts to drift. And when that drift begins, the system does not collapse immediately. It compensates, it adjusts, it attempts to maintain coherence, but those adjustments come at a cost. Because every correction introduces strain. Every attempt to preserve the original structure without full alignment creates tension within the system. And over time that tension accumulates until the system can no longer sustain itself in the same form. This is the point where collapse begins to become visible, not as a sudden disappearance, but as fragmentation, where what was once unified begins to separate into parts that no longer align in the same way. And this is what defines the fall of Atlantis within the mystery traditions. Not the loss of a place, but the loss of coherence, which raises a different kind of question. If a system collapses gradually, what happens to the knowledge it once held? To understand how knowledge survives collapse, you have to look at what actually breaks when a system fragments. Because within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, it is not knowledge itself that disappears. It is the structure that holds it together. When Atlantis is described as falling, what is being lost is not information, it is coherence. The alignment between elements that once allowed knowledge to function as a unified system. Once that alignment weakens, the relationships between those elements begin to loosen. Symbols that once pointed clearly to specific structures become less precise. Systems that once operated together begin to separate. And knowledge that once existed as part of a larger whole starts to appear as isolated fragments. This is the first stage of preservation, not through intention, but through necessity. Because when a system can no longer sustain itself as a whole, its components do not vanish. They persist, but without the structure that once connected them. This is why post-Atlantean traditions often appear incomplete. Not because they lack depth, but because they no longer hold the entire system. Each one preserves a part, a symbol, a method, a fragment of a larger structure that is no longer visible in its original form. And this is where memory begins to operate differently. It is no longer direct, it becomes distributed, embedded into different systems that can carry parts of the original structure across time. This is why knowledge begins to appear in multiple forms simultaneously, in architecture, in ritual, in symbol, in myth. Each one holding a piece, each one preserving a pattern, but none of them containing the whole. And this fragmentation changes how knowledge is engaged with. It can no longer be experienced as a complete system, it has to be reconstructed, recognized through patterns rather than presented directly. This is the condition that follows collapse, not absence, but distribution. And within that distribution, the original structure does not disappear. It becomes harder to see, because it is no longer contained in one place. It exists across many, which means understanding now depends on connection, on the ability to recognize relationships between fragments, to see how separate elements might once have been part of the same system. And this is where the process begins to shift again. Because once knowledge becomes fragmented, the method required to engage with it must change as well. If fragmentation changes how knowledge exists, then the next layer is how that knowledge is preserved without its original structure. Because once coherence is lost, preservation cannot rely on direct transmission. It has to become indirect. Within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, this is where symbol and myth begin to take on a different function, not as expressions of a complete system, but as containers, ways of embedding patterns into forms that can survive without needing the original structure to remain intact. This is why symbolic systems become more prominent after collapse, because symbols do not require full context to exist. They can carry fragments of meaning independently, and when arranged in specific ways, they can still point toward the larger structure they once belonged to. This is also why a myth begins to emerge as a primary method of preservation, not because it replaces knowledge, but because it encodes it. Stories allow complex relationships to be carried across generations without needing to be fully explained. They preserve patterns through narrative, they maintain structure through repetition, and they allow fragments of a system to remain connected, even when the system itself is no longer visible. But this form of preservation comes with a limitation, because once knowledge is encoded, it is no longer immediately accessible. It has to be interpreted, recognized, reconstructed, and this is where distortion becomes possible, because without the original structure, interpretation can vary. Different traditions may preserve the same fragment in different ways. Symbols may shift in meaning depending on context. Stories may evolve as they are retold. This does not mean the knowledge is lost. It means it is no longer stable in the same way. It becomes fluid, adaptive, capable of surviving but no longer fixed. And this is what defines the post-collapse state. A system that continues to exist, but only in fragments, carried through symbols, maintained through myth, and dependent on recognition rather than direct transmission. This is where the role of the individual becomes more important, because once knowledge is no longer presented as a complete system, it must be engaged with differently. It must be observed, compared and connected, not accepted as it appears on the surface but understood through the patterns it contains. And this is what sets the stage for the next phase, because once knowledge is encoded, it requires a new way of seeing to access it. When you step back from the idea of collapse, what becomes clear is that it does not remove knowledge, it changes how knowledge exists. Because within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, the fall of Atlantis is not the disappearance of a system, it is the transition into a different form of preservation. What was once unified becomes distributed. What was once direct becomes encoded. And what was once experienced as a complete structure becomes something that must now be recognized through fragments. This is why post-Atlantean traditions often appear inconsistent, not because they are incorrect, but because they are incomplete. Each one reflects a different aspect of the original system. Each one preserves a pattern, but without the full structure, those patterns are no longer obviously connected. This is where interpretation begins to play a role. Because once knowledge is no longer presented as a whole, the individual engaging with it must begin to reconstruct the relationships themselves. They must identify connections, recognize repeating structures, see how symbols, myths, and systems might relate to each other across different contexts. And this process is not linear. It does not move from one fixed point to another. It moves through recognition, through the gradual alignment of fragments into something that begins to resemble the original structure. But this also introduces risk, because without the full system, it becomes easier to misinterpret, to isolate a fragment and treat it as complete, to assign meaning without recognizing the broader pattern it belongs to. This is where many modern interpretations begin to drift, not because the material is wrong, but because it is approached without the structure that once held it together. And this is why the idea of Atlantis remains significant, not as something to be proven or disproven, but as a reference point, a reminder that what now appears fragmented was once coherent, that what now requires interpretation was once experienced directly, and that the process of reconstruction is not about recreating the past, but about recognizing the patterns that still exist within the present, because those patterns never disappeared. They were redistributed, and once they begin to be seen again, they start to connect, which means the next stage is not about collapse itself, but about what those fragments become, because once knowledge is encoded into symbol and story, it begins to take on new forms. If collapse transforms a system into fragments, then its significance lies not in what is lost, but in what continues. Because within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, the fall of Atlantis does not end the system. It changes how the system exists. What was once unified becomes distributed. What was once visible becomes embedded. And what was once directly experienced becomes something that must now be recognized through symbol, story and pattern. This is not a reduction. It is a transformation, a shift from coherence to preservation, from structure to encoding. And within that shift, something important happens. The system becomes harder to access, but easier to carry, because fragments can move. They can survive across cultures, they can be adapted, translated, reinterpreted, without disappearing entirely. This is why the patterns of Atlantis persist, not as a single system, but as recurring structures that appear across different traditions, in myth, in symbol, in the ways power, knowledge, and meaning are organized, each one reflecting something of the original structure, even if that structure is no longer visible as a whole. And this is where the process continues, because once knowledge is fragmented and encoded, it begins to reorganize itself into new forms that can hold meaning without requiring the original system to remain intact. This is where the idea of the gods begins to emerge, not as replacements for the system, but as expressions of it. Symbolic structures that carry patterns of power, function, and relationship in a form that can be recognized across time. This is the next stage, not the loss of knowledge, but its transformation into something that can survive, because once a system can no longer remain whole, it must become something else, and what it becomes is where we move next.
If knowledge fragments, it does not disappear. It reorganizes. And within the framework described in the secret teachings of all ages, one of the most enduring forms that reorganization takes is what we now call the gods. Not as simple characters. Not as primitive explanations for weather, death, fertility, fear, or power. Not as decorative figures placed inside old stories because ancient people lacked better language, but as structures, as symbolic containers, as archetypes of power that carry meaning after the larger system that created them has broken apart. Because once a unified system collapses, knowledge cannot remain in the same form. It cannot stay completely organized. It cannot remain fully visible. It cannot depend on the same institutions, the same schools, the same temples, or the same initiatory structures to preserve it. So it changes shape. It becomes portable. It becomes memorable. It becomes symbolic. And this is where the gods begin to emerge as something far more complex than mythology alone. They become vessels, forms capable of carrying fragments of a larger structure across time. A god can survive when a school disappears. A god can survive when a temple collapses. A god can survive when a language changes, when a civilization falls, when a priesthood is broken, when the original structure of meaning is no longer available. Because a god is not only a name. A god is an arrangement of symbols. A god is a pattern of attributes. A god is a relationship between forces. And this is why the gods move so easily across cultures. Their names change. Their images change. Their stories change. But the function remains. The Sky Father, the Solar Ruler, the Underworld Lord, the Mother of Forms, the Divine Child, the Trickster, the Judge, the Warrior, the Messenger, the Revealer, the Destroyer, the one who descends, the one who returns, the one who stands between worlds. These figures appear again and again because they are not random inventions. They represent recurring structures, patterns that human beings encounter externally in nature, politically in society, spiritually in symbol, and internally within the self. This is why the ancient gods cannot be reduced to superstition without losing the entire system behind them. A superficial reading sees many gods and assumes many beliefs, but a symbolic reading sees functions. It sees the division of power into recognizable forms. It sees the attempt to organize invisible principles into visible images. And this is the key. The gods make the invisible visible. They give shape to forces that cannot easily be described directly. The sun is not just the sun. It becomes a symbol of radiance, order, vitality, kingship, illumination, and consciousness. The underworld is not just a place beneath the earth. It becomes a symbol of descent, death, hidden knowledge, transformation, judgment, and return. The mother is not just a biological figure. She becomes matter, nature, fertility, containment, origin, nourishment, and form. The messenger is not just someone who travels. He becomes communication, transition, translation, intelligence, movement between realms, and the crossing of boundaries. This is how the gods function. They gather many related meanings into one image. They compress complexity into form. And because the form can be remembered, the complexity can survive. This is essential after collapse, because when knowledge is no longer preserved as a complete system, it must survive through forms that can carry more than one meaning at once. The gods do exactly that. They hold layers. They allow a single figure to contain cosmology, psychology, ritual, ethics, power, nature, and metaphysics all at the same time. This is why ancient deities often feel larger than the stories attached to them. The stories are only one layer. The deity itself is the structure behind the story. And once you understand that, mythology begins to change. It stops looking like a collection of tales. It starts looking like a symbolic architecture, a way of organizing reality through figures that can be remembered, worshipped, feared, invoked, studied, painted, carved, sung, and passed forward. This also explains why gods are rarely simple. They contradict themselves. They shift mood. They appear merciful in one story and terrifying in another. They create and destroy. They protect and punish. They reveal and conceal. To a modern mind, this can seem inconsistent, but symbolically, it is precise. Because real forces are not simple. Power is not simple. Nature is not simple. The mind is not simple. Transformation is not simple. A god that represents a true archetypal force must contain contradiction, because the force itself contains contradiction. The sun gives life, but it also burns. The sea nourishes, but it also devours. The underworld terrifies, but it also transforms. The mother creates, but she also consumes. The king protects order, but order can become tyranny. The trickster disrupts stability, but disruption can open the way to change. This is why the gods are not moral in a simple modern sense. They are not neat examples of good and evil. They are expressions of power. And power is dangerous when misunderstood. That danger is part of their meaning. The ancient gods were not designed to make reality comfortable. They were designed to make reality intelligible, not by flattening it, but by giving it form. This is why the gods often stand at the intersection between the human and the cosmic. They are larger than people, but not completely separate from people. They are cosmic principles shown in human shape. They speak, desire, rage, love, deceive, create, destroy, suffer, and triumph. But beneath those human qualities, something larger is being carried. The human form makes the principle approachable. The divine scale reminds us that it is not merely personal. This is the function of archetype. It allows the individual to encounter something vast through an image that can be held in the mind. A pure cosmic principle is too abstract. A god gives it a face. A story gives it movement. A ritual gives it presence. A symbol gives it continuity. And together, these allow the structure to survive. This is why similar divine figures appear across cultures that may seem unrelated on the surface. The Egyptian Thoth, the Greek Hermes, and the Roman Mercury are not identical, but they occupy a recognizable field of meaning. Writing, speech, measurement, transmission, boundary crossing, intelligence, translation between worlds. The surface changes. The function persists. The same is true of solar figures, underworld figures, divine mothers, storm gods, dying and returning gods, and sacred kings. Each culture expresses the archetype through its own language, landscape, politics, and spiritual imagination. But the underlying structure remains visible. This is not about flattening all cultures into one vague system. That would be lazy. The differences matter, but the repetitions matter too. And it is in the tension between difference and repetition that the deeper structure begins to show itself. Because if the same patterns continue to appear, the question becomes why? Why does power so often take the form of a sky ruler? Why does transformation so often require descent? Why does wisdom so often come from a boundary-crossing figure? Why does creation so often emerge from darkness, water, chaos, or the void? Why does divine knowledge so often need to be stolen, revealed, concealed, or earned? These are not just storytelling habits. They are symbolic memories. They point to the way human consciousness organizes experience. And within the esoteric framework, they also point to the remnants of a much older structure. A structure in which gods were not merely worshipped, but understood as keys. Keys to forces. Keys to processes. Keys to relationships between the visible and the invisible. This is why the gods are so often linked with planets, elements, numbers, animals, colors, metals, body parts, virtues, vices, and sacred directions. They are not isolated personalities. They are nodes in a system. Each god gathers correspondences. Each correspondence expands the field of meaning. A deity becomes a center point where multiple symbolic languages meet. Astronomy meets psychology. Nature meets ritual. Power meets morality. The body meets the cosmos. The visible world meets the invisible order beneath it. And this is exactly why the gods are so useful as carriers of fragmented knowledge. A single divine figure can preserve an entire network. Even if the full system is lost, the figure remains. Even if the correspondences are later misunderstood, traces remain. Even if the rituals change, the symbolic pattern continues. This is how memory survives collapse. Not as a complete document, not as a clean doctrine, but as a living symbolic form. This also explains why later traditions often reinterpreted earlier gods instead of simply erasing them. A god could become a saint. A goddess could become a symbol of virtue, temptation, wisdom, or nature. A planetary deity could become an astrological force. A mythic figure could become a moral lesson. A local spirit could be absorbed into a larger religious system. The name changes. The frame changes. But the pattern continues moving. Sometimes clearly, sometimes in disguise, sometimes reduced, sometimes elevated, but still present. This is the strange durability of the gods. They are difficult to kill because they do not depend on one form. They can migrate. They can be renamed. They can be hidden inside new systems. They can become symbols, allegories, demons, angels, saints, planets, virtues, psychological types, or literary figures. The archetype survives because it is deeper than the costume. And this is where the modern world often misunderstands ancient religion. It assumes that when belief changes, the old gods vanish. But symbolically, that is not what happens. The old forms may lose public authority. Their temples may fall. Their rituals may stop. Their priesthoods may disappear. But the archetypal structures they carried continue to appear. In art, in politics, in celebrity, in branding, in national myths, in cinema, in the way power is staged, in the way leaders are presented, in the way rebellion is romanticized, in the way beauty is worshipped, in the way destruction is feared and desired. The gods do not disappear. They return through whatever symbolic language a culture still understands. This is not a claim that Zeus or Isis or Hermes are secretly being worshipped every time a modern image resembles them. That would be too crude. The point is subtler. The structures they represented continue to operate because the human relationship to power, fear, transformation, desire, order, chaos, death, and meaning has not disappeared. We have changed the language. We have not removed the pattern. And this is why studying the ancient gods still matters inside this series. Not because we are trying to revive old worship, not because we are trying to prove literal beings, but because the gods show how knowledge survives by becoming image, how power becomes symbol, how fragments of a lost structure can continue to speak through forms that outlive the civilization that first shaped them. This brings us back to Atlantis. If Atlantis represents coherence and its fall represents fragmentation, then the gods represent one of the first major forms of preservation after that fragmentation. They are what happens when structure can no longer remain whole, but still needs to be remembered. The gods carry the pieces. They hold the forces in recognizable form. They allow later cultures to engage with fragments of the old system without needing full access to the original. But this also means the gods require interpretation. They cannot be read only on the surface. Their stories must be examined for structure. Their attributes must be seen as symbolic clusters. Their contradictions must be understood as part of their function. And their repetition across cultures must be treated as meaningful, not accidental. Because once we approach them this way, the ancient gods stop being relics of the past. They become maps. Maps of power, maps of consciousness, maps of the way human beings have attempted to understand the forces moving through the world and through themselves. And this is where the next stage begins, because gods do not move through history alone. They are carried by stories. Their power is preserved through narrative. Their meaning survives through repetition. And when those stories are repeated long enough, across enough time, they become something more than fiction. They become memory. Encoded memory. A way of preserving history, structure, and symbolic truth inside forms that can survive collapse. So the question is no longer simply what the gods represent. The question becomes how those representations are carried, how a fragment becomes a story, how a story becomes a tradition, and how a tradition becomes a memory of something older than itself. Because once the gods become narrative, myth begins. If the gods are structures, then myth is the system that carries them. Not as fiction, not as fantasy, not as decorative storytelling invented to explain thunder, death, harvest, stars, or fear, but as memory. A form of memory encoded deeply enough to survive when the original system has collapsed. Within the framework of the secret teachings of all ages, myth is not treated as a childish attempt to explain reality before science arrived. That is the modern reduction. It is clean, it is convenient, and it misses almost everything. Because myth does not function like a bad scientific theory. It functions like a symbolic archive. It preserves relationships. It preserves patterns. It preserves structures of meaning that cannot always survive in direct language. And this is why myth remains powerful even when it is no longer believed literally. A myth can lose its temple and still survive. It can lose its priesthood and still survive. It can lose its original language and still survive. It can be translated, retold, altered, misunderstood, moralized, demonized, romanticized, and still carry something of the structure that created it. That is not weakness. That is its strength. Myth survives because it is adaptable. And after collapse, adaptability becomes necessary. When a unified system breaks apart, knowledge has to move in a different way. It cannot depend on one center. It cannot depend on one school. It cannot depend on one complete chain of transmission. It must become distributed. And narrative is one of the most effective ways to distribute meaning. A story can travel. A story can be remembered. A story can be told to people who do not know the full system behind it. A story can preserve a pattern even when the teller no longer understands every layer of what they are carrying. This is how myth works as memory. Not perfect memory, not literal memory, but structural memory. It remembers relationships even when details change. It remembers the pattern beneath the surface. A flood, a fall, a descent, a forbidden act, a stolen fire, a dying god, a sacred marriage and a war in heaven, a journey into the underworld. A child hidden from a devouring power, a hero marked by unusual birth, a world created from darkness, water, chaos, or sacrifice. These patterns repeat because they are not simply stories. They are symbolic structures. And symbolic structures are durable. They can survive enormous changes in culture because they operate at a level deeper than surface detail. The names change. The landscape changes. The moral emphasis changes. But the pattern remains recognizable. This is why myths from different cultures can feel strangely related, even when they are not identical. They may not share the same characters. They may not share the same theology. They may not share the same ritual context, but they often share structural movement. Something begins in unity. Something divides. A transgression occurs. A descent follows. A trial must be endured. A hidden truth is revealed. A form dies. Another returns. A world is renewed, or a warning is preserved. This is not random. Myth is patterned because memory is patterned. And within an esoteric reading, those patterns are not merely psychological. They are also historical in a symbolic sense. Not history as dates and documents, not history as a literal timeline, but history as remembered structure. The memory of changes in consciousness, the memory of lost systems, the memory of catastrophes that become moral, spiritual, and cosmic images because direct records cannot hold them anymore. This is where myth becomes difficult for the modern mind. Because the modern mind wants to separate things cleanly. History over here, fiction over there, religion somewhere else, psychology somewhere else again. But myth does not respect those divisions. Myth can be historical without being literal. It can be symbolic without being false. It can encode memory without functioning like a modern record. And if you approach it with the wrong expectation, you miss its purpose. If you ask myth to behave like journalism, it fails. If you ask it to behave like science, it fails. If you ask it to behave like entertainment, it becomes shallow. But if you approach it as encoded structure, it begins to open. The flood is not only a flood, it is the overwhelming of a world, the destruction of a previous order, the cleansing or erasure of a civilization, the return of chaos, the need to preserve a seed through catastrophe. The descent into the underworld is not only a journey after death, it is confrontation with the hidden, the movement into darkness, the necessary passage through dissolution before transformation. The stolen fire is not only theft, it is the acquisition of forbidden knowledge, the transfer of power from divine order into human hands, the danger of illumination before wisdom. These stories survive because they carry more than one meaning. They are not fragile. They can hold layers. And this is exactly what makes them powerful as vehicles of preservation. After collapse, direct transmission becomes unstable. So knowledge hides itself in forms that can endure being misunderstood. That matters. A myth can be misunderstood and still survive. A doctrine often cannot. A technical system can disappear if the chain of explanation breaks. But a myth can continue even when its deeper meaning is no longer fully understood. Children can hear it. Poets can reshape it. Priests can ritualize it. Kings can use it. Artists can paint it. Philosophers can interpret it. Entire cultures can build identity around it. And through all of that, the pattern can remain, not untouched, but alive. This is why myth is not a lower form of knowledge. It is a different method of preservation, a living container. And like all living containers, it changes as it moves. This is also where distortion enters, because the same adaptability that allows myth to survive also allows it to drift. A symbolic pattern can become literalized. A cosmic process can become a moral fable. A memory of structure can become a simple story of heroes and villains. A god who once represented a complex function can become a personality. A descent that once represented transformation can become a place people fear. A symbolic death can become only physical death. A ritual process can become merely a tale. This is what happens when myth loses its interpretive structure. The story remains, but the system behind it becomes obscured. And this is why myths can feel both powerful and confusing. They still carry weight. They still stir recognition. But the original keys are often missing. So the modern reader is left with fragments. Images that feel meaningful. Patterns that feel familiar. Stories that seem to point towards something larger, but do not explain themselves directly. And that is because myth was never designed to explain itself directly. It was designed to preserve, to hold, to carry, to wait for recognition. This is why the same myth can reveal different layers at different stages of understanding. At one level, it is a story. At another, it is a moral lesson. At another, it is a psychological map. At another, it is a cosmological structure. At another, it is a record of initiation. At another, it is a fragment of encoded history. None of these layers necessarily cancels the others. They can coexist. That is the point. Myth is not linear. It is layered. And this connects directly to the symbolic language we explored earlier in the series. A word tends to move toward definition. A symbol moves toward relationship. A myth is a sequence of symbols arranged in narrative form. It is symbolic language in motion. This is why myth is so often built around repeated images. The mountain, the tree, the serpent, the flood, the cave, the gate, the child, the twin, the mirror, the wound, the crown, the descent, the return. These are not accidental decorations. They are symbolic anchors. They allow the narrative to carry deeper structures without spelling them out. And when those anchors repeat across traditions, they create a map. Not a perfect map, not a simple map, but a map of recurring human and cosmic patterns. This is how myth becomes memory. It remembers through repetition. It stores through image. It transmits through story. And it protects through ambiguity. That ambiguity is important, because if the meaning were too direct, it could be destroyed more easily. A direct teaching can be banned. A doctrine can be rewritten. A school can be closed. A temple can be burned. But a story can slip through. It can disguise itself. It can survive as folklore. It can become legend. It can become poetry. It can be dismissed as fantasy while still carrying structure beneath the surface. This is one of myth's deepest powers. It can hide in plain sight. Not because it is trying to deceive, but because symbolic memory does not require full conscious understanding to continue moving. A culture may preserve a myth long after forgetting why it mattered, but the myth remains available. The pattern remains intact enough to be rediscovered. This is where myth becomes not only preservation, but reconstruction. Because once the pattern is recognized, the fragments begin to connect. The flood in one tradition can be compared with the flood in another. The descent of one goddess can be compared with the descent of a hero elsewhere. The dying god can be compared with seasonal cycles, initiation rites, solar patterns, agricultural rhythms, and internal transformation. Connections begin to form, not to flatten all myths into one story. That would destroy their specificity, but to understand how different stories may preserve related structures. This is the correct tension. Respect the difference. Recognize the pattern. That is how myth should be approached in this series. Not as proof, not as debunking, not as a claim that every culture is secretly saying the exact same thing, but as a study of repeated symbolic structures that may preserve fragments of older systems. This is why myth matters after Atlantis. If Atlantis represents coherence and the fall represents fragmentation, then myth becomes one of the main ways fragmented knowledge survives. The gods become symbolic carriers of power. Myths become the narrative structures that carry the gods, and together they allow pieces of the older system to keep moving, not whole, not pure, not untouched, but alive. And this is where the word memory becomes essential. Memory is not a perfect recording. Memory reshapes. Memory condenses. Memory selects. Memory translates experience into forms that can be carried. Cultural memory does the same thing. It does not preserve everything. It preserves what can survive. And what survives is often not the literal detail, but the symbolic pattern. A catastrophe may become a flood. A lost system may become a golden age. A collapse of knowledge may become a fall from divine favor. The misuse of power may become a war among gods. The loss of direct perception may become exile. The promise of restoration may become prophecy. These are not random transformations. They are ways of remembering through symbol. And once you understand that, myth becomes far more serious. It becomes a record of how human beings preserve what cannot be preserved directly. It becomes a method for carrying the unspeakable, the abstract, the traumatic, the sacred, and the structural through forms that can endure. This is why myths continue to haunt cultures long after belief has changed. Because the pattern still speaks. Even when the old gods are no longer worshipped, even when the old rituals are forgotten, even when the old temples are ruins, the myth remains. And through the myth, the structure can still be approached. This is the transition that closes this stage of the series. We began with the mystery traditions as structured teachings. We moved through initiation, secret schools, initiates, temples, and symbolic language. Then we moved into Atlantis as a model of coherence, its fall as fragmentation, the gods as archetypes of power, and now myth as encoded memory. Each layer shows how knowledge changes form as conditions change. When the system is whole, knowledge can be lived. When the system begins to collapse, knowledge must be preserved. When preservation becomes indirect, it becomes symbol. When symbol needs movement, it becomes myth. And once myth exists, the next task is recognition. To read beneath the surface. To understand that the story is not the end of meaning. It is the doorway. Because myth does not simply tell us what happened. It reveals what a culture could not afford to forget. And sometimes, what it could no longer explain directly. So the question is not whether myth is true in the shallow sense. The question is what kind of truth it was designed to carry. What structure lies beneath the story? What memory survives beneath the image? And what begins to emerge when those memories are placed beside each other? Because once the fragments start to align, the system begins to speak again.